Oh, we are live. Good evening, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Hope you're all prioritizing your mental health, especially as we approach the end of the year. My name is Faeeza Lok. I'm a member of the National Leadership Collective at Rise Mzansi. For those who don't know, Rise Mzansi is a citizen-led, citizen-centered political movement gearing up for the 2024 election. So you will see us on the 2024 ballot. Rise Mzansi, we believe it is time for people to rise and build the South Africa we deserve. And our vision at Rise Mzansi is to build a safe, equal, prosperous, and united South Africa in a single generation. So that's in 25 years. So we believe that in someone's lifetime, they should be able to see this vision in reality. And I just want to touch a little bit about safety because today's theme is on gender based violence. When we speak about safety, safety means that Faeeza can walk alone in the streets and not feel that I have to send my live location to someone, that I can feel like I can take my phone out. I don't have to worry about a specific location and there's a certain rules and guards that I have to be up. That's what safety looks like to me. And at Rise Mzansi, we're currently running a People's Manifesto consultation process where we're trying to co-create the People's Manifesto with the people. And so we really want to hear from you on what safety actually looks like to you. So please do reach out to us. You can DM us, you can email us. Our website is www.risemzansi.org. So let's talk about gender-based violence. Gender-based violence is something very close to my heart. Um, Gender-based violence affects all genders, sexual orientation. It's a very real issue that affects the economy, which we're going to talk about that today. It affects the communities, it affects the family, it affects our well-being as an individual. And at Rise Mzansi, our commitment really extend beyond just understanding and knowledge that this is a huge issue. We want to understand the intricate roles that government plays, that society plays, and our civil organization plays in preventing and combating this issue together. Because we have to shift a mindset, as we learned yesterday from Women for Change. And we're privileged to have Kayan Leung. She is a public interest lawyer and activist. She's currently the head of the Strategic Litigation and Gender Equality Programs at Lawyers for Human Rights. She has 12 years experience in various NGOs and working on intersecting issues relating to gender equality, human rights, and vulnerable groups, and has a specific interest on sexual and gender-based violence. She's also working in environmental law and business and human rights. Her mission is to ensure the gap between lived realities of communities are reflected in policies and implemented in a substantive manner where access to justice is realized for all. She is an absolute force and a powerhouse. Welcome, Kayan. Thank you for joining.
Hey, Faeeza, and hello, Mzansi. It's great to be with you.
So I want to start off by asking a little on your background so our viewers can get to know you more. I know you've had some incredible wins in the gender-based violence space over the years in your work. Can you share a couple of examples that really stood out to you and have made a tangible impact on the ground on this issue?
That's a great question, Faeeza. So I'm not going to. So some of the examples that I will give, speak to my direct involvement in either litigation or watching briefs where we've intervened on specific cases around GBV. But I also want to start it and preface at the outset that we do not do this work alone. I think as an activist in the GBV space, I want to pay recognition to my sisters in the collective, in the movement in itself, and how we've been able to drive change towards eradicating and addressing GBV. So I wanted to start there. I think first and foremost, we have been involved in a number of watching briefs around gender-based violence cases. And of course, the need is so great. So we try, at least individually, I try take on specific cases where there is strategic value. So when we see there is a systemic issue, whether it be at a police station or the perpetrator of GBV is quite influential and kind of skirting the system within the criminal justice system, we will intervene. So to give you one example in a case that I think was really important, we intervened on a watching brief around a local politician that was in a specific ward. And I'm not going to mention any names, but essentially he assaulted his girlfriend at the time to death. He beat her to death with a shambok. And it was so interesting that it seemed like the police in the area, because of his political affiliations, didn't really want to get involved. They were kind of like slow on the case. And even when the individual was appearing in the courts, they were stalling the process, as many people try do. And so through our intervention and working with a GBV organization specifically, we put so much pressure across the system, the entire criminal justice system, that it made it impossible for this individual to escape accountability. And what resulted was a positive sentence against this, so against the perpetrator in this regard. And we've taken on many of these types of cases to show that whether it be the failure of a police official, for example, investigating officer in the manner they conduct, cases, whatever the case may be, in our intervention, it has most of the time led to a positive intervention or result. At a strategic level, there have been a number of cases where, as movements or just litigants, we've been able to change kind of the manner in which gender-based violence can manifest or contribute to. So one recent example is our involvement in challenging the constitutionality on parental leave. So as you might know, our current labor, our basic conditions of employment say that only women are entitled to 4 months maternity leave. And if you are a parent that is adopting or a parent through surrogacy, you were only offered less weeks. So I think it was around 10 weeks for both. And we've made it so that parents can decide, and this is whether or not you are a male or female parent, whether you are same-sex couples, etc. You can decide how you distribute and balance that leave, because this impression as society that like women are the only ones as care workers, and I'll get to the point a little bit later about why this is important, is perpetuating actually forms of violence, because there is this like economic interpretation of control in GBV cases as well. And so these harmful norms where we say only certain people do certain roles is very limiting in a society. Maybe a final point to say is, as a movement, we've been able, of course, everyone knows about, in 2018, the National Summit on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide, and of course the one that happened last year. That was a culmination of GBV activists in the sector. At the time, it was under the hashtag Total Shutdown, but all our organizations were mobilizing people for this one cause, to say, we want a national strategic plan on gender-based violence. We want it to be costed. And one of the demands was, we want a summit because we need to have GBV treated quite seriously. It is a pandemic in our country. We cannot have women and gender non-conforming people or gender diverse people, bearing the brunt of gender-based violence. People are dying, and the statistics are shocking, and what is being done. So I'll stop there. Those are just some of the examples of the work that we've been involved in.
Sheesh. So you spoke about the total shutdown, and it just highlights that the important role that civil organization and civil society plays when it comes to movement building. Even with the Black Lives Matter movement, and I only realized it this year when an organization called Black Males Initiative came to South Africa to speak to us about election strategy. It was hundreds of organizations that propelled the Black Lives Matter movement and the protest across the country in the US. So yeah, there's really power in building getting involved in different organizations and movements. And then you touch on the violent in gender roles. There's harm in that in perpetuating a bias on what women should be, men should be. That is something very interesting, and that's something that I've really taken a special interest on, because I really do think that one of the biggest issue in this country is leadership. Our leaders don't have the mindset that is helping our country to grow into where we want it to be, that is progressive, that's caring. So that's something that I definitely want to touch on later. Now, I want to touch on austerity. We often hear about austerity and budget cuts in the news, and but how does it play out from a legal perspective? Like specifically, how does austerity affect implementation of laws and regulation that design to prevent and address gender-based violence? What happens when there's budget cuts?
So I think as a premise, I want to say that austerity hurts women, and it can often lead indirectly to women being killed. It robs us of women's time. And I think from a South African economy perspective, it really descends, is austerity measures extends economy into further crisis. So it's really important to make sure that women and girls in particular are not sacrificed at the altar of austerity. So there's been a lot of discussions with civil society and care work advocates or even feminist economists that are advocating or fighting for an integrated gender accountable budget, and that women should be prioritized in policy making. So when you have governments trying to reduce budgets, through tax increases and spending cuts, the the service industry that the government is now trying to remove budgets from, where does that shift take place? So if you're talking about education, care, the care economy, essentially, that shifts to the society, or the societal shift onto women and girls. So in areas of health, education, and other public care activities, this is where you would see cuts. And because austerity is essentially quite patriarchal in nature, it means that it's the women and girls that often become those that have to be subscribed to the unpaid care work. And they're the ones that are then absorbing the shock of the economy because they're left to be forced to fill the gaps by a failed public sector. So I'll give you an example. Our country's currently facing an issue of water crisis, right? And if you look at in many communities, I mean, I did a lot of work in the Eastern Cape at one stage. And when you interrogate culturally, it was the women and the girls that would manage the water in the household. So during this water crisis, they are the most affected because they need to cook, they need to clean, they're the ones expected to do the family laundry. And in specific contexts, I mean, even in sort of informal settlements or peri-urban areas, and especially in rural areas like the Eastern Cape, they are the ones that have to walk long distances to fetch water. And this increased their risks of being exposed to GBV. So austerity measures then force these households to absorb the care work that should be provided by the state and the private sector. And the cost is essentially women. So even if you look at, for example, where you have to care for people, the young, the ill, the old, or even like domestic work like cooking, cleaning, washing, tending to firewood or water, that is without financial compensation, but somebody has to do it. And so this whole notion about care work or the care economy is firstly globally not recognized or is often misrepresented. And it is part of how the capitalist production or the capitalist economy views things. You know, corporations see that men are mainly the ones that are in the space. And so austerity in these measures has that double effect of, number one, cutting down on public services. So, for example, your shelters, the hospital clinics, etc. And then in that regard, it also has this double-edged sword, because then indirectly these other services kind of fall upon women in particular to carry out these roles. And it does make them more susceptible to gender-based violence.
Yeah, so you mentioned how these budget cuts can actually affect these services, because gender-based violence survivors rely on these support networks, from counseling services to shelters to legal aid. So, considering like your experiences, do you see austerity like impact? Do you think it potentially will impact these very crucial support system that actually perpetuates more gender-based violence cases?
There is definitely a risk of that, and in some cases we do see it. So, for example, there's currently in Gauteng in particular an issue with accessing shelters. NGOs that provide shelters and operate those shelters are doing it incredibly under stressful situations. But then you also look at other aspects where, you know, the manner in which they are cutting down services, it really is placing people in precarious situations. I mean, you have NPOs or NGOs shutting down because they're not receiving funding, for example. And having said that, and I think a lot of people doing really crucial work in this space, and we don't want to take that away from them. A lot of these duties should actually be carried out by the state. And so there's this disingenuous relationship, let me call it that, where the state is supposed to be providing basic services, protection, you know, healing, and all of this. And then they say we can't, so let civil society or NPOs do it. But where are NPOs supposed to get their funding? It's a very limited pool. So if government is not sort of funneling these funds into these spaces, then you are left with a pool of survivors which are not able to access services that are fundamental for their healing, for their progression, because they're stuck in this perpetual cycle. If you are a victim of domestic violence or survivor of domestic violence, and you don't have the financial ability to just move out and go get your own place, you would rely on a shelter. But if the shelters aren't open, it kind of forces you back into a relationship, because you're like, my choices are being homeless, where I'm also possibly susceptible to violence, or I should go back to my abusive partner because at least I have a roof over my head. Maybe my final point on this is that we have a national strategic plan on gender-based violence. It is supposed to be multi-sectoral, which includes private sector, government stakeholders, civil society, and it's a good plan. But the fact is, it is currently not costed, it is currently not funded, and so what we have seen is, you know, they kind of like announce X amount of money is being dedicated to GBV, but they're essentially just moving the funds around from department to department. There was a report 2023 last year about the implementation so far on the NSP. And what they basically found was that a lot of departments have not integrated the plan in their departments. So what they're doing is essentially moving money around. And so they might say it's not ring fenced, because ring fencing money for GBV means this is only and specifically for GBV interventions. If you don't ring fence the money and you don't embed this plan in your budget, you're either going to, when some other crisis comes up, say, oh, I have this pool of money, it's going to be prioritized for something else. Or even worse, and this has happened before, where departments do not spend their budget, it gets returned to Treasury. And Treasury says, okay, well, you clearly don't need this money, so I'm going to cut X amount from your department. And so it is terrible. It is a terrible effect, because you're actually not planning properly about what your interventions are, and you're not getting the resources which are heavily needed to address GBV.
Yeah. And I think it was during COVID, there were even funds that were not even spent in our budget. And in South Africa, we're so bad at preventing a crisis. We just, when there's a crisis, then we like scramble around. We get take money, but it's a very reactive respond. So it's yeah, what you're sharing right now is something that Women for Change also shared yesterday, which is not a cent. There was commitment by the government, but not a cent actually went to organizations like Women for Change, who are actually doing the work of combating gender-based violence. So does this
Maybe I
really
could
speak
just
to?
add on that point. I think it's really important as stakeholders in this country. You should be asking these questions. When government says, I've dedicated 20 million or what, or 20 billion or whatever the case may be, don't just take it at face value that money is there, it's been committed, it's there. Ask the questions and follow up to say, did you really dedicate this money to specific organizations or specific areas or pillars of intervention? Show us the proof, like what has happened to these funds, because people often just hear about funds and then they don't ask questions. And I think we have every right to be asking this information. This is part of our accountability mechanisms. We should be holding government to account.
Yeah, and this is our money.
Exactly.
Yes. I see there's a couple of questions from the chat. We have Sadie who said, "Hi, ladies. When gender-based violence cases are solved and perpetrators are arrested, do the perpetrators have to share their reasons why they did, whatever violent act they did, so then the public can better understand? It forms part of a statistic, or it forms part of the data of understanding why people commit to gender-based violence. You have to share those reasons."
Hey, Sadie, great question. I'm glad you're engaging and it's nice to meet you. So, when perpetrators are found guilty, it kind of depends on the process. So, sometimes if people get arrested and they plead guilty straight away, and that sometimes does happen, they would be required to give a statement, and basically explain why they're pleading guilty. In some cases, people kind of deny the charges and they plead not guilty, and the state would then have to go through this whole process to prove this person's guilt, according to our criminal justice system. In most cases, the courts are more concerned about whether or not this person did the crime and then sentence the individual. They don't often kind of interrogate the why behind it, although in some cases the reason does come out organically. What should be happening, and this is part of the prevention strategy, it's pillar 2 in the National Strategic Plan, is that we should be having programs that try address GBV at a prevention level so that it doesn't even get to that. I can share, just generally speaking, there are a number of reasons why people are perpetrators of violence. Number one, we live in a very violent society, and none of this I'm prefacing is an excuse for the behavior, because if you commit a crime, you should be held accountable for it. So I'll start off there. But we live in a very violent society historically, where, like, even during apartheid, people were accustomed to extremely violent communities and behaviors. So you're almost socialized in a manner that's like, okay, well, how I respond is violence because that's what I received. And there's a lot of research, even in cases of abuse in the home, like children that are abused, there is a propensity for them as they grow older to maybe be a perpetrator of abuse. So that is one area. There's also the issue about like toxic masculinity and like this overly harmful understanding of patriarchy in our society, where it's like, okay, women aren't good enough, you see women as inferior, or this the social norms that we create. So it's almost like you dehumanize people based on their gender. And from that perspective, coupled with this like violent environment we live in, you kind of think, okay, well, I can treat people in a certain way. So these are some factors that that actually contribute to gender-based violence. Other people, there are individual cases. They just, to be honest, I think they are not mentally well, which is not an excuse either. So there are so many factors, but there is research around this, and of course there are structural drivers like alcohol and drugs and all of these things that can enhance the risk of gender-based violence in spaces.
There's a comment from Sylvester who basically said that in the community of Machapeng, I hope I'm saying that right. They found. I'm assuming he's part of an organization, but they found a lot of gender-based violence survivors have seen so much death because of gender-based violence in front of them, and there's so much trauma for the survivors and the people who are around them. And seems like he have intervened and actually reach out to 44% of the people who need healing and give them the healing and counseling that they needed. And so I just want to follow up on that comment. Firstly, amazing work, Sylvester. This is the power of ownership and agency of recognizing, and the leadership actually of recognizing there's a problem in your community. Let me do something about it, because waiting for the government to do something is just like that will not happen. Maybe if we vote for Rise and Mzansi. But anyways, so what Sylvester is saying is that a healing. There's a gap in getting healing for the community. So what does that service look like? Have the government actually specifically trained or have specific counselors on the ground specifically trained to deal with these cases? What intervention have the government done?
So firstly, also echoing your sentiments, Faeeza, Sylvester, incredible work that you're doing. I'm sure, and I have no doubt you're making a huge impact in your community, and I want to applaud you for that. So in terms of social workers or counselors and healing, there are definitely individuals trained to provide this, and it comes in different formats. So there are specific sort of social workers or counselors that are attached to family violence, FCS units, so that if survivors of GBV report this, they should be referred to counselors and get assistance. You also have social workers that are trained to intervene where required. There are also multiple sort of NGO operated helplines that provide services, counseling services as well. So in theory, it is there. Is it a perfect system? Absolutely not. In fact, some experiences are better than others. It's luck of the draw right now. I mean, what you want to eventually get to is a uniform or universal standard of care and service that is provided across the country. We cannot have kind of service in Johannesburg, Jersey, Gauteng, for example, and then a very different experience to somebody in, I don't know, in the Northern Cape, for example, or KZN or the Eastern Cape. We should be working towards the same level of excellence that any public servant or any service provider for counseling or any GBV related service should be offering.
Yeah, definitely. And that's really what, an equal society look like. Someone that's born in Sandton versus someone in St. Alex. Like there shouldn't be two type of basic services that are offered. So looking at the bigger picture, have you noticed any patterns or trends that link to austerity and the reporting of gender-based violence incident? When there's budget cuts and money are not being put towards, preventing this violence or even supporting gender-based violence, are there less people who would actually report? And I think you did really mention that, austerity do amplify the challenges in combating gender-based violence. But speak a little bit about the reporting. Does austerity actually affect people reporting on these cases?
So I think there's at least two reports around austerity and the linkages to GBV. I think one is a South African report and the other is more of a global context. But essentially, in countries where there's where data and research are available, and they've interrogated the impacts of austerity policies, the studies indicate that these cuts to public health and care services have increased mortality and morbidity, primarily among the most marginalized in society. So women in particular, as the main users of these services, have carried the consequences of these cuts, both physical, emotional, and at a psychological level. And a lot of the times these cuts directly impact funding for organizations, as I've mentioned, and support services combating GBV. So it kind of strips away the first and most often the only line of assistance or protection that these women rely on for survival. And it leaves them more exposed to direct violence at a time when the rates of violence is increasing. So to answer your question, yes, there are linkages to them. There's quite a lot of literature around this as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Because majority, and I've read it somewhere, that majority of the cases are actually not reported. There's so many cases that of the stats that is not accounted for because people are so scared to report what happened to them because they get re-traumatized by the system. So I want to touch on the law and how intersectionality can be more, like how can we use an intersectional lens, an inclusive lens to approach designing or drafting the law, and ensuring that justice is accessible to everyone, especially those who are often feel like they are left out in the system. So how can we actually, can you just break down how laws and policies can adopt using an intersectional lens?
Well, I think first, it's a great question, by the way. I think first and foremost, you need to ensure that the lived realities of people are factored in to this entire process. So often when you kind of get draft policies or pass draft bills that later on become legislation, of course we have public participation processes where people can make submissions and engage in that, and I think that's an important space. But on the other hand, it's almost like these well-intentioned people just draft something and they think, okay, it's a great piece of legislation and we're going to do it in a certain way. And sometimes it seems like a good piece of legislation, if they factor in all the lived realities, because context matters. You cannot just import a great idea from another geographical area or even country for that matter and say, okay, it's going to work in South Africa. It often doesn't because our contexts are different. And so as a starting point, taking into consideration that no one is left behind, who are the marginalized groups? So it's not only looking at race, it's looking at class. Like how does one, I'll give you an example. How does a Black lesbian woman living in Soweto that has to travel to Sandton every day experience GBV compared to a white woman living in a middle class suburb? That kind of intersectional lens, like your race, your class, even your culture, religion, all of these factors have to be considered to say, am I designing a piece of law that is really speaking to the needs of the most vulnerable in this situation? And if you approach it in that point, then that is a good starting point. But if you get a great law or a piece of legislation, and I think for most parts, a lot of our pieces of legislation are really good, you need to ensure you implement it. And I think from a GBV perspective, that is a huge challenge. Our implementation is so poor. There is no accountability. Sometimes I feel like there are no adequate standing operating procedures or guidelines about how public servants should be conducting themselves. And if they are, and people are not following that, they need to be accountable. They need to be held accountable because they are public servants and they're providing a service. They're not your, their salaries are being paid by taxpayers and they're providing a service. So there needs to be a correlation between what the law says. Is it good? How are you implementing it? Are the needs of people being met? And those, you have to be asking these questions throughout the process.
Yeah. No, you broke it down very, very it's in a very simple and real way, which is to ask people. So I think that, and I think that that's part of it links to part of our politics, which is a listening politics. If we really want to design something that truly speaks to someone's lived experiences, we have to ask. So when I was looking through your bio, I thought this was quite intriguing. You have a very specific interest in environmental law. So I really want to ask you about a little bit about that. How do you see the intersection between saving the planet and combating gender-based violence? And more importantly, how can legal frameworks address these two interconnected challenges?
So I think first and foremost, intersectionality and how things overlap is really important. And I always try apply that perspective and thinking in any of the work I do. But climate change or the impact on the environment definitely intersects or impacts gender-based violence. So if you look at how it affects your food systems or your ecosystems, natural resources, the impact on socioeconomic systems, human health, welfare, and how changes in climate are now increasingly a driver of conflict and displacement. It also has a grave consequence of GBV. It increases the drivers of violence, especially in conflict areas and displacement and food insecurity, etc. And a lot of studies at a UN level, I mean, even I gave you an example about like access to water and women and girls being the ones that have to access the water and they're more at increased risk of GBV. That's an immediate, obvious example. But really, women and girls in particular are at the highest risk of GBV from climate-related issues and disasters. So again, they're primarily responsible for food production and water collection globally. And as resources become scarcer and more unaffordable, this rate of violence will increase. And then you're also looking at socioeconomic pressures that can drive sexual exploitation and abuse. In some countries or contexts, you might have more early or forced marriages and intimate partner and domestic violence as well. So in fact, at a UN level, they've actually acknowledged that that the issue of climate change or the impact on the environment is a form of gender-based violence because the root cause of GBV is gender equality and unequal power dynamics. And the environment or climate change contributes to these drivers and basically mediates factors which exacerbate GBV as well.
That makes sense. I was speaking to my colleague the other day. We were thinking about the root causes of gender-based violence, and we're saying that for as long as South Africa it's the most unequal country, as long as inequality still exists, we will still experience this. And I like the fact that you speak about unequal power dynamics. We need to speak about power, and the power that's, we all have power, but there are certain power that people will show up in a room that they will naturally have where others don't. Like if someone's a little bigger, someone's, is a man, someone's a little more attractive. Like all of these are power dynamics. Someone who have a little more money. And that's something that's very, very interesting that you mentioned. And it's definitely it's a system. It's like patriarchy. We need to actually have a lot of conversation and a lot of mindset shift to get to a place that's more equal. Last question. So, drawing from your experience in working in the NGO spaces and with government, how important it is to collaborate between civil society organization and government? How important is it for government to speak to civil society organization in dealing with a what we will call it a multifaceted challenge of here right here? Yeah, why would that be? How important would that be to you?
So I think the role of civil society historically has not been disputed. I think um, in terms of accountability mechanisms, civil society has in the past and continues to play a huge accountability role in ensuring that voices of communities are enhanced. I think it is almost like this relationship where the communities should be engaging with government directly, but where you've spoken about power imbalances and the relations dynamic. Civil society also has historically a strong presence in ensuring that government does what they're supposed to do, or alternatively, that they don't go back and basically claw back on rights that are afforded within our constitution. So it's almost like we are here as a form of a safeguard against government doing whatever they want. And I think if you look at the media, whether it be through the courts or advocacy, etc., it kind of civil society works quite closely with communities and public as our partners to ensure that there is legitimacy, and where it is not always safe, or where people aren't able to use platforms to voice their opinions or what they need to do, they can go via civil society to support this process. So absolutely, I think it's important to have in a flourishing democracy, where our country does say we want to recognize and realize human rights for all. There is definitely a role for civil society to work with public, and to engage with government. It is not necessarily supposed to be an adversarial relationship. Where things can be easily resolved, civil society should say, hey, government, we're seeing A, B, and C as issues. Can you try address it? But if they don't want to come to the party and they're like, go away, we can do whatever we want, then there's room for holding them directly accountable. And so there is power in these processes as well.
Mm-hmm. I love that you mentioned that civil organization plays an accountability mechanism, that they are the ones who are like the people who actually watches over whether the government are being held accountable to their actions. I really like that. Um, Thank you so much, Kayan. That's Kayan Leung, everyone. Thank you for your time. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and engaging with us. This is Faeeza Lok from Rise in Mzansi. If you would like to get involved with Rise, please go to our link in bio, or you can go to www.risemzansi.org to get involved. Let's not just be observers. Let's participate in our democracy. Democracy means that we get involved. We have to get involved. This is our home. And creating a more inclusive and equitable world, it's a responsibility that all of us carry. So let's rise for women, for children, and for the LGBTQAI plus community. Thank you, Kayan. Thank you, everyone. Take care of yourself.